The Unseen Hour. Chapter 1: The Road Less Traveled. Samantha Sam Evans had always found solace in the open road. Driving was her escape, a way to clear her head and forget about the pressures of her life. This particular trip was meant to be a break from everything: the stressful job, the recent breakup, the sense of being stuck. She had no destination in mind, just a vague idea of heading west, wherever the winding roads might take her. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the endless stretch of road ahead. Sam was just about to turn back and find a place to rest when she noticed something peculiar: a faded sign on the side of the road that read, "Welcome to Fairview." Fairview. She'd never heard of it, and it wasn't on any of the maps she had consulted. Curiosity piqued, she decided to take the turn, figuring she might as well explore. The road that led to Fairview was narrow, flanked by dense woods that seemed to press in on her as she drove. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching out to ensnare her. The further she drove, the darker it became, as if the very light of the moon was being swallowed by the forest. Eventually, the trees gave way to a small, quaint town. Fairview looked like something out of a postcard from the 1950s. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, a few small shops, and a town square with a white gazebo at its center. It was picturesque, almost too perfect, and eerily quiet. Sam parked her car near the square and stepped out, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. There was a chill in the air, the kind that crept under your skin and made your bones ache. As she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She noticed a man sitting on a bench near the gazebo, staring blankly ahead. As she approached, she realized he wasn't moving at all, not even blinking. "Excuse me," Sam called out. "Can you tell me where I am?" The man's head slowly turned towards her, his eyes vacant and glassy. "Fairview," he replied in a flat, monotone voice. "Right." "Fairview," Sam said, uneasy. "I mean, where exactly is Fairview? I've never heard of it." The man just stared at her, his expression unchanging. "Fairview," he repeated, as if that was all he knew. Sam's unease grew. She turned away from the man and started walking, hoping to find someone else who could give her answers. As she passed by the shops, she noticed that the interiors were dark and empty, though there were signs of recent activity: half-finished meals on tables, a newspaper left open on a counter. It was as if the townsfolk had just stopped. The feeling of being watched crept over her, and she spun around, expecting to see someone behind her. But the streets were still empty, the only movement coming from the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Sam decided she'd had enough. She hurried back to her car, intent on leaving this strange town behind, but as she reached for the door handle, she froze. Her car was gone. She spun around in disbelief, searching the empty square for any sign of it, but it had simply vanished. Panic surged through her, and she tried to calm herself down. Maybe she had parked it somewhere else and just forgotten. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. A clock tower in the distance began to chime, the sound deep and resonant, echoing through the empty town. Sam glanced at her watch. It was midnight, but the town remained bathed in the same eerie twilight as when she had arrived. And then she noticed something else. The man on the bench was gone, replaced by a woman in a floral dress, her head bent as she slowly swept the ground with a broom. Sam watched, her heart pounding, as the woman repeated the same sweeping motion over and over, never lifting her head. Something was terribly wrong here. Chapter 2: The Loop begins. Sam's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had to find someone who could explain this, someone who knew more than the robotic man on the bench. She hurried through the empty streets, her footsteps quickening as her anxiety mounted. The first place she tried was a small diner on the corner of Main Street. The sign above the door flickered weakly, casting an unsettling light on the entrance. She pushed the door open, and a bell tinkled softly. The interior was straight out of another time. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter with swivel stools stretched across the room. A jukebox sat in the corner, but it was silent, its lights dim. Behind the counter stood a man in a crisp white apron, drying a glass with a rag. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and almost soothing. Sam approached the counter, her nerves on edge. I'm lost," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how I got here, and my car is gone. Can you tell me where I am?" The man's expression didn't change. "Fairview," he said, the same word spoken with the same flat tone as the man on the bench. Sam clenched her fists, frustration bubbling up inside her. "I know that. But where is Fairview? How do I get out of here?" The man paused for a moment, as if considering her question. Then he set the glass down and pointed to the clock on the wall behind him. "It's almost time." Time for what Sam asked, but the man didn't respond. Instead, the door to the diner swung open, and a group of people walked in, their faces blank and emotionless. They took seats at the booths, each one moving in a stiff, mechanical way. Sam watched in horror as they repeated the same actions, sitting down, picking up menus, ordering food, all without saying a word to each other. Suddenly, the clock struck midnight again, and the scene around her shifted. The people vanished, replaced by a different group who repeated the exact same motions as the first. Sam backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She stumbled out of the diner and into the street, her mind reeling. The town was caught in a loop, reliving the same moments over and over, and now she was trapped in it too. Chapter 3: The Heart of the Loop. Desperation clawed at Sam as she wandered the streets, trying to find anything that could break the cycle. She saw the same people over and over, performing the same actions with the same blank expressions. Every time the clock struck midnight, the scene reset, and she found herself right back where she had started. But as she observed the loop, she noticed something strange. There was one building in the town that never seemed to change, a large, imposing house on the outskirts of town, its windows dark and its door tightly shut. The townsfolk avoided it, their paths veering away from it every time they passed by. Sam felt a pull toward the house, an instinctual sense that it was the key to understanding what was happening in Fairview. She made her way to it, her footsteps hesitant but determined. The house loomed over her as she approached, its dark windows like eyes watching her every move. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees that surrounded the property. But Sam pressed on, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. It swung open with a creak, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with old, faded portraits that seemed to watch her as she entered. The door slammed shut behind her, and Sam jumped, her heart racing. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. No answer. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The further she went, the more the house seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the air growing thicker. And then she found it a room at the very center of the house, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, the darkness more oppressive. Sam pushed the door open and stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight. The clock was covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. Sam could feel the power emanating from it, a dark, malevolent force that made her skin crawl. She approached the clock, her hands trembling. Somehow, she knew this was the source of the loop, the thing that was keeping Fairview trapped in time. If she could destroy it, maybe she could break the cycle and escape. But as she reached for the clock, a voice whispered in her ear, cold and sinister. "Leave." Sam froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around, but there was no one there. The voice whispered again, closer this time, almost as if it was inside her head. "Leave or be trapped forever." Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to ignore the voice. She reached out and grabbed the clock's hands, trying to force them to move. But they wouldn't budge, stuck in place as if rooted in the very fabric of time itself. The room grew colder, the darkness closing in around her. Sam could feel the presence of something behind her, something dark and terrible. The voice whispered again, louder this time, more insistent. "Leave," but Sam refused to let go. She pulled with all her strength, and finally the hands of the clock began to move. As they did, the room shook, the walls groaning as if the very house was in pain. The voice screamed in her head, a sound so terrible it made her ears ring, but she kept pulling. The hands of the clock spun faster and faster, and the darkness around her began to dissipate. The presence behind her grew weaker, the voice fading into a distant echo. And then, with one final pull, the clock shattered. The room exploded in a burst of light, and Sam was thrown backward, crashing into the wall. She lay there, gasping for breath, as the house around her began to crumble. But she had done it. She had broken the cycle. Chapter 4: Escape. Sam stumbled out of the house, her body aching, her mind reeling. The town around her was in chaos, the buildings collapsing, the ground shaking. The townsfolk were nowhere to be seen, vanished along with the loop that had trapped them. She ran through the streets, dodging falling debris, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. The road that had brought her to Fairview was ahead, a clear path out of this nightmare. She didn't stop until she was back on the highway, the town of Fairview disappearing in her rearview mirror. As she drove, the sun finally began to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. But even as she escaped, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, following her. The memory of the voice, the dark presence in the house, lingered in her mind. And as she glanced at the clock on her dashboard, she noticed with a chill that it had stopped at midnight. Fairview was gone, but the darkness that had trapped it wasn't finished with her yet. If you enjoyed the chilling story, then make sure to like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next scaring story is just around the corner.